because I forgot that at the very beginning, but we are now recording. To begin with, gotta move all my little images out of the way here. We're going to start off with a little bit of psychological stuff, for lack of a better adjective, about what's going on right now with our teenagers. When we're starting to talk about all the developmental changes that they're going through, especially when we're starting to look at psychology of a teenager, we always kind of lean back on Erik Erikson's studies of teens. He really studied human growth and development from infancy all the way to late adulthood. And adolescence is one of the areas that they really focused on. And so we're talking about early adolescence, which has become earlier and earlier as time has gone on here. So we're talking about roughly, late 10 to about 14 years old. Erikson had a lot of different codes and different things, categories for the different stages of development, but the ones that are probably most common for early adolescence is this idea of identity versus role confusion. So you can see up on the screen there, cognitively, adolescents in this stage have very limited abstract thought. It's getting there, it's being developed, but overall, the world is in their early stages of adolescence is still very much black and white. Their intellectual interests are starting to develop, but it takes time to expand those interests. As they're talking about this idea, or as we're talking about this idea of identity versus role confusion, a little bit more about that. So the major question that they're trying to answer psychologically is really just the question, who am I? And that is probably how you see it play out in all their interactions at home, with their peers, sports, school, all of the things. It's really just kind of centered around this idea of identity. Social relationships become really, really important at this stage of development because they're learning from their peers and they're adapting their behaviors, their moral code from their peers as well. We would like to think as parents, we still have a big role in that, but the reality is that those peer groups are just as important to them as their family relationship. The idea of role confusion really comes in, and that's where a lot of the conflict for teens comes from, because the idea of role confusion is this idea of, I don't know where I fit in. And we see that's basically every day here in middle school, is this idea of where do I fit in with the rest of the group? What makes me normal? What makes me abnormal? And obsessing over all the little minutia of everything that they do because they're just trying so hard to fit in. Typically, early teens are drifting from one task to another because of this. It's a really hard stage because oftentimes they are really excited by life in general, but they're also really disappointed by the minutia that life is starting to offer because they're starting to see those worlds in shades of gray rather than just the typical black and white that they have been through their early years. To deal with this idea of role confusion, adolescents kind of go through this rite of passage that really is just this period of adolescence. And that's where they are starting to develop their sense of self. They're trying to develop that moral code that we're talking about. Over time, they start to develop self-conscious, or they become more self-confident, but it does take time. And obviously there's a lot of growing pains that are involved in that. Typically, by the time they get to the ages of 13, 14 years old, their interests have really started to shift and change and to develop into things that they may not have been interested in before. Their world really starts to expand a lot more. So, they're focusing more on growth rather than just the world around them. As we look at the rest of those bullets on the slide, obviously identity and image is a big part of this change. They are playing with all kinds of new ways of developing themselves, whether it's changing their names, having different ideas about their sexuality, different clothes that they might be wearing, what their body looks like. They will do even weird things like changing the way they speak or changing the way they laugh because they're just emulating what they hear their peers do and are looking for that acceptance. Talked about it a little bit already about how important those friendships are. The good about those friendships is that they're helping develop that sense of self. The bad is that it oftentimes does come with a lot of drama, especially as they start to weave in and out of different peer groups as they're trying to figure out their place in the world. And then the other big change for them is this idea of independence, where they are starting to shift and move away from a world where parents or caregivers dictate the world around them and are starting to figure out, hey, I can do a lot of these things for myself. And with that comes a lot of strife at home as they start to push back on the different boundaries that we as the parents have set out for them. So I think I've kind of covered everything on this slide, and I am going to go ahead and advance.
Thanks, Mr. Guy. So that takes me back to my psychology and human development classes. You did a nice job there. We all get to be students all the time, particularly when it comes to our teenagers and trying to figure out what in the world is going on in their brains. I'm a parent also, as many of you all know, to 2 kids in this age group. So I'm constantly wondering what is going through their mind. You know, one of the things that we want to recognize is that the brain develops at different stages throughout their life, right? So the frontal lobe of their brain is not fully developed at this point. It actually takes a long time for that to develop. Usually around 25 years old do we start to see that come to full development. So we've got a little ways to go, but they will get there. That frontal lobe, though, helps them think logically and helps with problem solving and helps with some of those things that you hear teachers talk about with regards to executive functioning. How can they plan? How can they organize things? And so when they are presented with a problem or a challenge or a stressor, that part of the brain that allows us adults to kind of work through maybe a step-by-step problem solving process is not what is driving that process for them. What actually drives everything is the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala. So when they react emotionally, they're reacting very much in line with what their brain development, where it is. So making those connections between the logical part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain really presents a little bit of a conflict for them. And that's what causes a lot of that emotion, because they can't reconcile that and they can't explain and verbalize to you all oftentimes what they are thinking. Rather, they could probably tell you what they're feeling. And this is one of those things where they can use some help in being able to identify what those feelings are. So not to jump forward, but one of the things that families can do to support their students, and some of the work that Mr. Guy and Ms. Wright and I do, is to help them name what those feelings are. Because once they name them, it normalizes it for them and it makes them feel like, oh, okay, I can kind of now start to see what happened to lead up to that and what that feeling really is. And when they can name their feelings, we can support them through that. The trouble comes in when you start to see that anxiety and that stress be something that becomes a little bit more the norm because of that inner conflict. Something that we think about a lot in school is the way that they are hijacked throughout the day, right? And so if you think about the last time something didn't quite go as you had planned as an adult, right? We even experience what we call this amygdala hijack, where that emotional response is what immediately fires and takes over. So it might be you're running late and there's a car accident, right? It might be you get a call from school saying your kid is sick. And so you have to kind of rearrange your day to come pick up your child. It might be something else in your schedule as you kind of work within your family to be sure everyone's getting to the right place and you're all moving in a couple different directions, and all of a sudden a schedule changes and you've got to adjust on the fly. Might trigger a more emotional reaction, right? Even as adults. So if we think about what that feels like in our own adult space, and we realize that our adolescent students and kids are still learning how to regulate that and how to work through that when they're also hit with a lot of different challenges throughout the day, we can see how that can take a toll on their emotional regulation. The students, the kids are in school trying to reconcile that conflict and might be in an elevated space of fight or flight, right? That stress response that we all have that helps us take on those challenges. And they're looking for different things with regards to, am I accepted? Am I connected? Do I belong? What is my self-worth? Because that's where they are with that identity development that Mr. Guy just went over. And so as they're constantly questioning that, it really does tax that emotional center, and is what leads us to see so many of those extreme ups and downs because of how their brain is responding.
So to continue the conversation that Heather just had, there's other trouble happening too, because there's a lot of chemicals going on in the body of these kids at this age. And so one of the biggest things that's going on is the oxytocin, and it's the bonding kind of hormone. They're trying to bond with their friends, they're trying to bond with their teachers, but they're also very self-centered still at that point, and they're trying to figure out who they are and what I like and what I don't like. And they're also trying to move from that black and white to those, they're beginning to see, life has some shades of gray. And how do I figure that out? What do I do with that? And so they're not real sure about that. So they question and they wonder, and lots of different things are happening. It begins to get a little bit better as they age. And normally when they begin those early high school years, we'll see that change. But on the next slide, we'll also talk about hang on, I'm sorry, Cabell, back up one more time. So there are also some other hormones that are happening too in addition. So there's serotonin, and serotonin is that mood regulator that regulates the mood. And as all of us know that have teenagers in our home or have had teenagers in our home, mood can be something that fluctuates all the time. And you're like, where did that come from? But the serotonin, when it's working great, things are good, and you feel a sense of happiness, you feel a sense of being pretty satisfied. It regulates our sleep cycle. Think about teenagers and how they sleep and how they sometimes can get their days and nights mixed up. And it also affects their appetite. Think about how kids eat. Sometimes they don't want to eat anything, and then other times they're starving. So that's the serotonin chemical. However, when we see that the serotonin might be low and it might be fluctuating, that's when we see some things that we feel like are a little bit off, like maybe they're feeling bad about themselves, or maybe they have that low kind of mood, and you ask, are you okay? Is something going on? Or maybe they have memory problems. How many times have you told kids something and they're like, I don't remember that? And you're like, really? Because I just told you that. So, and then maybe sometimes their appetites for sweets and all uptake because they're trying to updo that serotonin chemical. Sometimes if we boost serotonin, it can help with things like anxiety and some OCD kind of things, or when kids begin to feel panic. And then there's also another chemical that's happening. And so that one is the dopamine. And dopamine here again is that feel good kind of chemical. And when it's all working, we feel pretty satisfied, we feel pleasure. But when it's not working, we see things begin to pop up too. And so we just need to be cognizant of all of those different things that are bouncing around in a teenager's body when they're in puberty, and be aware of some of those things as adults. And sometimes simple things like having conversations about nutrition, having conversations about sleep and exercise can be helpful when we're looking at the regulation of those hormones. Okay, Mr. Guy, thank you. So how does it play out when all of these things are going on? Our brains are different places, those chemicals are going on. A lot of times in adolescence, you're going to see things that they are probably not likely to do. They're not going to think always before they act. They're going to act and then maybe think about it later. They're probably not going to pause to think, if I do that, what might be the consequences? They're not even thinking about that. They're just thinking about what they want to do. And then they're probably not going to think about, is something that I'm thinking about doing, is it going to be dangerous? Probably not. So they're more likely to be pretty impulsive on things that they do, the ways that they act, the ways that they think. And they're going to misread a lot of social cues. Like, for example, have you ever heard kids say, and they're staring at me, or they're laughing at me, and they're just missing those social cues. Maybe those things really aren't going on, but they think that they are. And so I know in our counseling world in middle school, we deal a lot of that when they're trying to interact with their peers and their new peers here at school with them. We deal with a lot of those kinds of things. And then sometimes they may start to think about dangerous kinds of activity. Maybe they think about things on social media that they shouldn't get into, or maybe they think about something like smoking. And so that's where we have adults have to be there to listen to them and observe them and to guide them when they're in these times of change. What do we do as counselors and as parents and teachers? What do we do when all of this is going on with our kids? Well, one of them is some just common sense kind of things that I think we all know. Make sure kids get plenty of sleep. They don't always want to sleep when we think that they should, but I think establishing good bedtimes is really important, because an exhausted teen is no fun, as we always know. They're no fun to deal with sometimes, and then sometimes it makes, when they're in school with us, difficult. So we need to make sure that simple things like sleep is important. We need to remember to encourage that positive behavior when we see that and we note it, and that we don't always result to that nagging. So here's a funny story. So I was cleaning out things from my teenager that's old now, and I found a contract that we wrote of things he was going to do. And one of the things he put on there was no nagging. Because sometimes I think as adults, when we get frustrated and we don't know what to do with the behaviors, we result to that nagging, which really doesn't, is really not helpful. And then finally, have open-ended questions that we ask them, so that they don't just give us those yes or no answers. Ask them questions where they have to respond a little bit more, like, tell me something good that happened today, or is there one thing that you can tell me that I need to help you with? And those open-ended questions may lead to some discussion that may be beneficial for both you and your team.
And just be aware, sometimes it's going to be like pulling teeth, and we all have those days. We can understand that. Another thing is to help your child really just start to explore the world around them, right? And so that's trying to find maybe some new outlets for creativity that maybe heretofore now they have not yet explored. We offer a lot here at Lakeside in terms of our exploratories, but there's a much bigger world out there for them other than just school. So getting them involved in things, whether it's music, sports, there's clubs at schools, all those types of things, even video games in moderation, can be positive for them, because they're still interacting with their peers and learning from them. Obviously, especially when it comes to video games and computer usage and things like that, moderation is obviously the key here. And trying to make sure that you're setting boundaries for your teens is obviously important. And another thing that is going to be obvious, but it needs to be stated, is just trying to stay connected to them by being interested in the things that they're interested in. And this by no way, shape, or form means that you need to be an expert in Pokemon or Minecraft or Roblox or any of the things that are important to them. But when they want to share with you the world that they've created online, or whether they want to share with you the images that they've been drawing in their notepad, that's a really, really important opportunity for you all to jump on, so that you can get a glimpse into their world, because it's fascinating to watch. It really is. I mean, there is nothing better than our jobs here at Lakeside as the counselors, just getting to talk to kids and finding out, what interests them and what motivates them. So taking a little bit of a dip into their world is always a real positive thing. Beyond that, if we start applying some of the things that we're talking about here when it comes to the brain, and kind of tapping into what Mrs. Wright said, if they give you a problem that they need your help with, help them to explore options. It's really easy as for parents, and I include myself in this as well, to tell the child yes or no, and not really give them the option of trying to figure out the right answer for themselves. But as they're trying to develop that moral code, giving them the chance to figure things out on their own is that step that we kind of need to take. And you can kind of baby step this as they're growing up, obviously. But one of the things that we try to really work with our kids on in our offices is just problem solving skills. And when they come to us with a problem, our job is really not to give them an easy out. It's really to help them try to figure out a process where they can figure out a couple of different options of different avenues they might be able to choose from, and then evaluating which one of those options is going to lead them to the best choice for success. So giving them the chance to kind of problem solve with you and helping them through that and modeling that behavior for them is really, really important. Number 2 here is beware of pruning. Pruning, and Ms. Wright and Ms. Lindsay will help me if I miss anything with this one, but pruning is where if we are not constantly using something, especially at this age, those skills, those ideas start to become less fired in the brain. So in other words, if they're not accessing it on a pretty regular basis, they start to forget those skills. Part of this is because of the development that they're going through in terms of the internal psychology. There's so much information coming at them that they have to data dump the stuff that they're no longer using. And so you have to kind of be aware of that if they're starting to lose focus on the things that are important to them and starting not to do some of those skills that have heretofore now been important to them, that's what you got to watch out for. So a good example of this obviously comes with school. If they become too wrapped up in video games and they're not doing their schoolwork and therefore they've forgotten how to study, or in sometimes it comes across in really weird ways, like suddenly they've forgotten how to write complete sentences and things like that. It's just because so much stuff is being purged in their brain by all the other information that's coming in that they're kind of on system overload. Ask if you want them to, or when they have a conversation with you, ask if they are looking for you to respond as a parent, or if you're just there to listen. Because oftentimes some of the biggest fights that we'll get into with our teenagers is simply because we will try to offer our 2 cents when they're not really looking for it. So if you start to notice that there's an uptick in the conversation where they are becoming more and more frustrated when we do respond, that's a good time to pause in the conversation and just ask, what is it that you need me to do here? Are you looking for me to respond? Are you looking for me to help? Or do you just need me as a parent to listen to what's going on in your world? And sometimes you'll kind of see this look of just like relaxation kind of cross their face, like, oh, okay, yeah, I just want you to listen. And they just do this big uncorking of all this information to you, and you get to take that snapshot with you for the rest of your day and just see how they're doing. Number 4, provide boundaries. They are still growing. And as much as they're going to want to push those boundaries, they still need them. They are testing out those boundaries because they are developing that moral code that we talked about. Yeah, sometimes that even means that they're going to try to negotiate those boundaries with you, but that's what you want. You want them to have the conversation about, hey, how come my friends get to stay up late and I don't? How come my friends get to go out to do this social event and I don't get to go? Because the alternative to that is obviously that they don't trust you enough to have those conversations, and potentially as they get older, try to sneak and do those things without your permission. So the trick is to give them those boundaries so they still feel safe and secure, because that nurture thing is still a thing at this age. But at the same time, you want to be able to start to give them a little bit of a longer leash and give them time to talk about those boundaries with you. Last but not least, use of praise and positive rewards still goes a long way. They oftentimes are getting this from other sources as well. So trying to reinforce the behavior at home that you deem acceptable versus the behavior that they're displaying that is not acceptable to you is really, really important, as it reinforces those pathways that we're trying to strengthen as they grow and change. Ms. Lindsay, Ms. Wright? Yep, go for it.
Can I add a quick footnote? So I know that one of the things when I think about boundaries and negotiating boundaries, one of the things that can be a challenge for an adolescent is boundaries around social media use and cell phones and devices, because oftentimes they're being introduced for them during this time of development. And so I want to acknowledge that we are going to have a conversation, another one of these forums around social media in the future, because that was also identified as a hot topic. But I also want to acknowledge that there is some interesting research around the brain chemistry and how that social media and the likes and the streaks and all the things that kind of your kids are interested in, how that does affect the brain chemistry. So when we think about like helping them solve problems and having conversations about what they're interested in, I would also strongly encourage you to have conversations about what they're looking at on social media and have them share some of that with you, because it's another way for you to connect with them, become aware of it, and have some meaningful conversation with them around how it feels for them and what they're seeing, and does it impact them positively? Does it impact them negatively? And is it mindful or is it mindless? And to have conversations about the differences with regards to use of social media and technology. It's a key part of their life that we certainly can't ignore. We have to figure out a way to help with those boundaries and continue to have those conversations around those.
So at this point, I think we've kind of gone through the nuts and bolts of the lecture, but we do want to make sure that we allow time for questions and things like that. So you should have the ability to either drop something in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, and I'm going to stop the screen share so that I can actually see everybody, which will probably make things a little bit easier. Anybody have any questions or things that maybe sparked an interest that you want to dive deeper on?
I may have a question. I hope I'm going to be clear. Sorry. So the kids in middle school are supposed to learn things and they are not concentrated. So my question is how to help them get those knowledge that they need and that will be required in high school and then in college, so that they don't have too much delay.
We don't fall behind.
So they don't fall behind, my husband said. That makes sense?
I think I understand your question. I think what you're saying is how do we help foster some of these skills so that they're continuing to grow and develop the way that they need to continue to grow as students in an academic world?
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of that is, I mean, you all please pitch in, but a lot of that is very much built into how we deliver things in the classroom. We try to help allow for a lot of conversations around different academic skills, right, that help reinforce that executive functioning. We want to push that, right, as much as we can, even though we know that the brain is going to develop on its own rate. So when we do different things around organization in classrooms or around note-taking or around study skills, all of that is helping to encourage those connections in that frontal cortex so that they can gain those skills and those strategies that help make those connections for them. And then, of course, we also, through our community building, we're doing what we can to help students feel safe in our building, to feel safe with other students, to help them advocate for themselves and learn how to solve some of those conflicts and manage their emotions. Like I said, a lot of times, you know, we're helping kids put words around different feelings, helping them figure out different ways to solve different problems and face different challenges. So it happens really on a very daily basis. And it's very obvious to those of us that are in the school that it's happening, and to the teachers in the classrooms and how they're delivering instruction and helping students with some of that.
I'd like to add too, though, just to be aware of what kids are learning. And so, you know, there is a Schoology that where you can go on and see what kids are learning in each one of their classes. And we will be doing another presentation about Schoology and Portal. But just if you're aware of what kids are learning in history and what they're reading in their language arts classes, and then having those conversations at home. And so we're making that connection of what you're learning in school and having some good conversations at home helps to bridge that school-home relationship. And so I think that's just another way to make sure that, you know, the message is school's important and your learning's important and we're involved in it as well as your family.
Okay, thank you.
Got a good question in the chat. Let me scroll back up to it because more are coming in. Hold on one second. Many of the typical teenage thinking and behaviors can be interpreted as symptoms of ADHD. And how do you tell them apart? And oftentimes, honestly, that can be really tricky at this age. It is somewhat easier for us at the middle school level because oftentimes students will come to us already with a diagnosis because those signs and symptoms can oftentimes show up in elementary school before they get here. And oftentimes we have to lean on the family physician to help us with this, because they have a better history of the medical side of things with every single child. But the point is accurate. You know, at this age, most of our kids probably would fall under the umbrella as worrisome when it comes to ADHD behavior, because they are kind of scatterbrained. They are kind of all over the place. They can all be really impulsive at this age. So it is hard to figure that out, to be honest. But what we do is we try to track them through all their classes. If we ever have a concern that a student might be beyond just like the normal impulsivity, when it comes to being a preteen or a teenager, then we always will check in with the teachers to see if that is playing out and how it might be playing out within the other classes. So if you ever have a suspicion that maybe that might be going on with your child, make sure you reach out to us, make sure you reach out to your family physician, and we will be happy to kind of assist there.
Other questions in the chat came up about social media. And should parents be monitoring, I guess, social media use and cell phones? And, you know, I think it's a very personal decision. I think the research indicates that yes, you should. You know, I kind of think about it like, you know, when your kids are younger, we put a lot of effort into knowing, you know, whose house you're going to, or, you know, getting to know their classmates. And when they are given a device that opens their world up to so many things, then I think it seems reasonable that families would want to have some ability to monitor that so that your students are being safe. So again, it's very much a personal family decision. But I think the research indicates that yes, that is certainly a best practice.
I think there was another question very similar to that in the chat, but I think Ms. Lindsay kind of covered it. You know, again, I think whether your child should have social media or not, it really comes down to a personal decision between you and your family. But I would concur with Ms. Lindsay that if you do decide to let them have some sort of account, and they will try to use all the tricks to convince you that they should, right? Their world is online, their friends all have it. You're the mean parent that doesn't let them have a cell phone or let them have Snapchat or something like that. It's about to say Facebook, but they don't use Facebook. Realistically though, it has to fit into what you believe is right for your child, because every child really is different. They're flooded with negative images on social media. So it's definitely something that you're going to want to track. There's nothing wrong with setting those boundaries if you're going to gift them with a phone or text messages and things like that, to let them know, yeah, I'm going to be the parent that reads all your text messages and you're just going to have to suck it up, because that's the deal with getting the phone. Other questions?
And one more that popped in about how much video game time is reasonable. I think I think there are different professional groups that have weighed in on that over the years with regards to screen time. And again, I think that also depends on what is your kid doing during that video game time. You know, is your kid using that video game time to connect with friends, and is that a huge social outlet for them, or are they doing other things? Again, I go back to that mindful versus mindless use of device time or screen time. And so I think certainly there are recommendations out there based on age that you can find. But I think, again, that really is a family decision and a personal decision based on the communication you have with your kid and how they're using that time. Miss Wood, do you want to say hi real quick? You popped in.
Yeah, I lost my computer. So sorry, I was a little bit late. I was running around. And so as you're talking about executive functioning and organization, I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, I still struggle with that too. But I wanted to thank you everybody for showing up. I think you guys did a really good job. It was really great for me to listen, because as many of you know, I've got a 6th grader this year and I'm like, yep. So it's just really nice to know that like what I'm experiencing, other people are experiencing too. And so I just want to thank you, like the parents and you all, for putting this together for us. And if you guys have questions, we're always here. And if you have suggestions, we do know that social media in your teen is a really desired session to offer. We also know that how to navigate Schoology and Parent Portal is something that other parents are really interested in when we got the feedback for open house. And then we had to kind of shift gears. But if there are other topics that you are talking about with other families that you think that would be beneficial for us to offer, please email us and we'll see what we can put together. I will say that I know there's a lot of questions about social media because that's so prevalent in all of our lives. A couple of resources, the American Pediatrics Association, I think it's APA. They have a really good resource on their site. And then Common Sense Media is one that is another one that is good to get information from. It vets movies. It vets video games. I go there a lot because my son constantly is like, can I have this video game? And I'm like, well, I don't know. So it also rates video games for families, and it's just it's kind of cool because what it does is it'll say kids think this is the age range that should be allowed, and then it'll say parents say this is the age range. So it's nice. It does some good job on doing some research on that. So those are two really good websites that you guys could check out if you have some more questions about that. But again, I just want to thank you guys for coming. And we'll post this presentation, I think, on our website and all the others so that if you can't catch one, you'll be able to catch it on our website.
So we already have several planned though, and we will make sure that we share them in the Shark Mail and also post them on our website so that you can be aware of the topics and the dates that we'll be doing this again.
Thank you all so much for coming and spending your evening with us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.